Hello and welcome to the channel, British History X. What we're going to be discussing in this particular video is the town of Caerwent, or Venta Silurum, which was a town effectively that was administrated by the Britons, now the Silures tribe. But if you look here, what do Cadw recognise this as? Oh, they recognise this as a Roman town. And this is the problem, and this is what I want to discuss here. So this is actually a very impressive town, well, British town from the Roman era period. Obviously, modern historians and modern academia will refer to this, from the mainstream, will refer to this as a Roman town. When you think of a Roman town, you're often thinking that there must have been individuals within this town speaking Latin, doing their everyday business in Latin, doing everything, in traditional, let's say, Mediterranean style, Roman-esque day-to-day business. And the Britons were obviously out in the fields, wallowing around in mud, because that's what Britons do, don't they? Because they're unsophisticated barbarians, and therefore, if they're unsophisticated barbarians, they're incapable of coming up with a written language and all sorts, as mainstream academia have always stated. So therefore, it's a Roman town. But this town actually was a administrative town for the Britons, and they obviously would maintain it and look after it. So if you went back to this town back in the early centuries AD and beyond, you would have obviously heard Brythonic languages being spoken, and that would have been the day-to-day language of this town, because it was run by Britons. Now you might say, but surely this is Roman, because we can see remains of obviously what we call Roman architecture, which we see here, the foundations of buildings. Now, one of the things the Romans were very good at is when they would come into an area, if they couldn't, let's say, conquer it militarily, in order to keep the peace, they would often transfer knowledge. And the Romans were good at this. And what they would do is they would say, look, Britons, we understand that perhaps you're not too happy with us being here, but what we can do in the meantime is we can show you things, we can give you our skills on engineering, on building work, on sewage systems, and you name it. What did the Romans ever do for us? You know the old joke. And effectively, that's what would have happened. So the Britons would have, from an extent, taken on that knowledge and kept with that knowledge. Okay. Now, let's say, where would they have spoken Latin in a town like this? Well, the Roman delivery system or mail system was a good system. Here we are. You can see the modern day post office. So there would have been something equivalent within that era. And what would have happened is, let's say a Silures tribesman would want to contact a family member who's perhaps working in another province, could be in an auxiliary in another province. And what they would have done is they would have said, gone into that building, obviously may have conversed in the Brythonic language, but then what they would have done is then perhaps written down the instructions in Latin, because obviously as it goes into other provinces, the common language of administration would have been Latin, so that other people in other provinces would know that this letter has to go to a certain destination. And that makes common sense, yeah? But certainly you wouldn't have had this town where everybody, men, women and children, would have been speaking Latin all day long. That certainly wouldn't have happened. One of the things that I would say to you, and the only other way, places where they would have spoke Latin is perhaps doing any kind of the education area. So Latin would have perhaps been included along with ancient Greek, because they were classical languages within the administrative world of the empire. Obviously, Greek went on to be a major language of the Eastern Roman Empire, and perhaps those languages would have been taught in the school system at the time, or the education system, but the Brythonic languages of the Britons would have been spoken. Okay, and that's really, really important. Now, one thing that they'll tell you in modern, let's say modern academia is these walls are some of the most impressive walls actually in any town of the Roman era in Northern Europe. So if I just go into Google Earth here and I'll just put in Caerwent, first thing you see effectively, if I go to images, is the walls. And as you can see here, there's numerous walls. And they are very, very impressive fortifications. Now, coming back to this, these walls actually were not put up until the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. And there is a specific reason why that was, because during the 3rd and 4th century AD, there was a lot of infighting within the Roman Empire. We've often heard about certain Roman generals coming over during those periods, declaring themselves as Caesars, using really the Britain as a kind of outpost to do that, having the safety net of the Channel, declaring themselves Caesar, gathering as many troops as they could, marching back over to Europe, and then fighting with other Roman factions. And that is potentially linked as well to the first Arthur in the 4th century AD, and how there was a lot of Roman infighting and campaigns going on in Europe, and that really would make sense from that perspective. So that's really where, but that's another tale. But that really shows that who would have built these walls then? Well, it would have been the Silures tribe, the Britons at the time, who would have said, you know what, we're absolutely fed up of these Roman vagabonds coming over, declaring themselves Caesars, causing all this upset, and it would have been protection from effectively the Romans. So the Britons were defending themselves from the Romans, and that really is where that defensive wall was came into force during that 3rd and 4th century AD. Now, where do I get my sources that the walls were 3rd to 4th century AD? Well, one thing there's been numerous sources that have carbon dated those walls and have said it's from around that period. There is even mainstream academia admits it's from that period, 3rd and 4th century. So that shows really that, yes, it's a Roman town, and they would lead you to believe that these defensive walls were made to keep the barbarian Britons out of this Roman town, but that was never the case. It was the Britons effectively keeping themselves safe from Roman factional infighting. And that's important to remember. So this really, if I get a chance, come down here. If I just go into Google Earth, and I will just go down at Street View, you can see here it's quite an impressive place. You can't really see the main front of the wall, but it is a impressive. You can take a long walk across the wall, which is effectively that there in this picture here. And they've got these impressive fortifications going along. But you'll see that, and they have also dug up evidence as well that British guards at the time were respected and worshipped here, which really does reinforce it as being a British town, all right? Now, one of the other things that I just want to close on this topic is what you must be saying. Well, okay, we understand that was an administrative town of the Silures tribe. And again, I believe this was done by negotiation, right? If the Romans really wanted to, they could have put, they would have attempted some kind of genocidal campaign against the Britons. I think the Britons resisted them in this part of Wales, certainly, and they were not able to subjugate them. One of the most telling tales is actually that there's very little evidence that the Romans actually went west of this point. Very little evidence indeed. I think somebody had mentioned in conversations on Britain's hidden history and various conversations that I had that there's actually Wales's or Cymru's only national spring is in the Vale of Glamorgan. If the Romans were really influential in that area, they would have turned the spring in this area, in the Vale of Glamorgan, and they would have utilised that in the same way that they had over in Bath. So that's just something to remember. So they never really got as far. So I'm absolutely convinced that this area was predominantly still run by the Silures tribe, that Caerwent was an administrative centre, that it was, almost an interaction with the wider Roman world, and that would be fine. They would have been speaking the Brythonic language, but having to deal in Latin and ancient Greek when they had to. How does that then explain that the legionary fort? Well, if you actually look at the legionary fort, it was only really a fort for the initial century, a good 100 years, I think, after its first construction. And then it was actually the local Britons that took over so I go to Caerwent. It was actually the local Britons that took over the running of this fort. And again, that's another story, perhaps on another video. But to believe that the legionary fortress was there and up and running for 3 or 4 centuries is not really true. It was only really there for the first century. And this Caerwent was, I believe, the main administrative centre for obviously the period of the Roman era. Okay, for the Britons. I don't like to use the term Roman Britain or just default it to Rome. Obviously, you've seen numerous videos where it kind of that annoys me because it's almost a suppression of British history. I'd much rather this be Caerwent British town in the period of Roman era. That would have been far better, but they'll never say that, so they just call it a Roman town. It's effective laziness as far as I'm concerned. So from the back of that, then, this town obviously went to play an important part in future kingdoms after obviously the collapse of the Western Roman Empire for the Britons. So this is a real important area. So if I just scroll out, for those people that perhaps aren't familiar as to where it is. Again, this is southern Cymru. Over here we have England for you, and then you would have Caerwent here, or Venta Silurum. There we go. So again, I hope you've enjoyed the video. It's just we will get on the ground at some point. Obviously, I'm trying to kickstart the channel. It's early days, and I want to get some discussion points going. And obviously, the weather's not too good at the moment. It's been snowing today, and once we get out to spring, summer, we'll do some walks around these areas, and it'll be we'll do some interaction videos on the ground. And what I'll start doing is putting these into playlists, and off the back of the playlists, you'll quickly be able to say, right, okay, Britain's History X, they've looked at this from the air, they've looked at this from the ground, they've looked at certain aspects of this particular town, this British town, and we will break it all down bit by bit. But yeah, thank you very much, and to the next time.